Eleanor, the new Duchess of Ravensmere, had been mistress of the house for 11 days when she first heard a woman weeping behind a wall no one was allowed to open. It was near midnight. The candle had burned low, she had risen for water, and the sound came up through the cold stone, the way water finds a crack, thin, patient, unmistakably human. A whole wing of that great house stood sealed, one corridor, one door of black oak, and a single key that hung, always, at the belt of the steward. The servants called that wing haunted. They crossed themselves when they passed its mouth, and they did not linger. Eleanor did not scream, she did not run. She pressed her ear to the cold oak, and she listened. The steward found her there. Silas Thorne moved through that house like the draught. You did not hear him come. You only felt the temperature change. That wing has been shut since the late Duchess died of her madness, Your Grace. His voice was smooth as poured cream. The dead do not care to be disturbed. Behind him hung 40 years of family portraits, gilt frame after gilt frame, dukes and duchesses staring down the long gallery. And one only, a young woman with dark hair, had been deliberately turned to face the wall. Its blank canvas back gave nothing to the candlelight. That night, the weeping came again. And beneath it, clear and low and entirely sane, a woman's voice said her own name aloud in the dark, the way a person does when they are frightened of forgetting who they are. If you have ever known a truth the whole world insisted was impossible, a thing you saw with your own eyes while every reasonable voice around you called you a fool, then sit close, because this story is for you. Subscribe before we begin, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Before we go on, if stories like this one hold you, do this for me. Tap the button that keeps you here for the next. And tell me in the comments the town you're watching from tonight, the place where you're sitting as you listen. I want to see how far a story like this can travel. Now, back to the house on the hill. And the woman behind the wall. She had come to Ravensmere in the last grey week of a Northumberland winter. Eleanor was a clergyman's daughter. She wanted you to know that plainly, because she never forgot it herself. Her father had a small living in a small valley, a stone church, a garden he weeded on his knees. She had grown up counting pennies and darning the same 3 good dresses and learning the names of every family in the parish, because a clergyman's daughter learns early that people are the only wealth a modest house keeps. She had not been raised to a place like this. When the carriage brought her up the long avenue between the bare black elms, and the house rose out of the fog with its 100 dark windows, she felt her heart go small and quiet in her chest. The Duke had married her without fuss. Edmund of Ravensmere was a good deal older, courteous, tired around the eyes in a way she did not yet understand. He had lost his first wife, she was told. A sad business, a sickness of the mind that took her young. He did not speak of it, and Eleanor, who knew grief has its own weather, did not press. She thought she might be gentle enough, in time, to warm a house that had gone cold. She was young. She believed a house could be warmed. The servants met her in the great hall in 2 silent rows. That was the first strange thing, though she could not have named it then. Servants in her father's parish gossiped and bobbed and blushed, and looked you dead in the eye to take your measure. These did not. They stood with their hands folded and their gazes fixed somewhere near her feet. A dozen of them, and not one would meet her eyes. When she said good evening, warmly because that was her nature, a few lips moved, but no sound came that she could hear. It was as if the words themselves had been trained out of the house. Then a man stepped forward from the shadow of the staircase, and the whole room seemed to lean toward him the way iron filings lean to a magnet. "Your Grace, you are most welcome. I am Thorne. I have the honour of managing the estate." He bowed. It was a perfect bow, and there was something in it she disliked before she could reason why. A bow should give. His took. Anything you require, you have only to ask me. Not the staff, they are good creatures but simple, and they'll only muddle your wishes. Ask me. I am the house. I am the house. He said it lightly as a pleasantry. She smiled and thanked him and thought no more of it that night. But the phrase stayed, the way a splinter stays, working itself deeper the longer you leave it. In the days that followed, she began to learn the shape of the place, and the shape was wrong. Rooms were kept dark. Not out of thrift, Ravensmere was plainly rich, but by habit, by rule. Shutters closed at noon in half the wing she was permitted. Fires laid small. Curtains drawn against a sun that so rarely came anyway. When she asked a housemaid to throw open the drawing-room shutters and let in what light there was, the girl went pale and glanced over her shoulder before she moved, and moved as if the shutters might bite her. And through all of it walked Silas Thorne, keys at his belt, ledger under his arm, unhurried, everywhere at once. He knew where every candle went. He counted the coal. He interviewed the tradesmen at the servants' door and sent them away with his own figure written on their bills. When Eleanor, meaning only to be useful, asked to see the household accounts, a Duchess's honest right, he brought them to her with a smile and turned the pages himself, quickly, his blunt finger moving down the columns, narrating in that cream-smooth voice so that she never quite got to read a line before it was gone. You mustn't trouble yourself, Your Grace. Figures are dreary work. The late Duchess never bothered with them at all. Her affairs were all settled by me. In the end, God rest her, every last shilling put right and quiet. It's what I'm for. Every last shilling. Settled by me. God rest her. Eleanor heard it and thought only, how sad, how young she must have been, and how good of him to spare a grieving house the burden of it. She thought nothing else at all. Remember that the most dangerous lies are the ones we thank a man for. She met the Duke at supper and at little else. Edmund kept early hours and long silences. But she watched him with Thorne, and what she saw troubled her in a way she could not yet put into words. Her husband, a duke, a man whose family had held this ground since before the Armada, deferred to his steward. Not openly, not as a servant to a master reversed. But when a question of the estate arose, Edmund's eyes went to Thorne first, and waited, and took the answer Thorne gave him, as a man takes a physician's diagnosis, with relief that someone else has the knowing of it. Thorne will see to it. Ask Thorne, whatever Thorne thinks best. It was the whole vocabulary of the marriage between the two men, and it had clearly been spoken for years. One afternoon she found the sealed wing again by daylight. She had not meant to. The house was a warren, and she was still learning it. But she turned a corner she thought she knew, and came upon the black oak door at the corridor's end, and the long gallery of portraits leading up to it, and the one canvas turned to face the wall. In daylight the turned portrait was somehow worse than at night. In daylight you could see it was no accident. Someone had lifted it down, reversed it, and hung it again backward, on purpose, so that its face would never look into the room. The dust on its frame was even. It had hung that way a long time. She reached to touch it. I wouldn't, Your Grace. Thorne, always Thorne. He came down the gallery unhurried, and stood a little too near her, and looked at the turned canvas with an expression of mild, managerial regret. A painting of the late Duchess. In her decline she could not bear her own likeness, tore at it, wept before it. It distressed the household terribly, kinder to all to keep it as it is. You understand. He said understand as though her understanding were a thing he issued to her, like a candle stub, to be returned. And this corridor, Your Grace, best not walked. The floors are unsound past the door, and the memories unsounder. There's nothing here for a young mistress but a chill. She let her hand fall. She said, of course, she was ashamed of prying. That was her failing, if you can call it one. She trusted the machinery of the house before she trusted her own 2 ears. She had been taught that a good woman keeps the peace and assumes the best, and she had not yet learned that some houses turn that goodness into a weapon and hand it to a man like Thorne. But small things had begun to catch in her, like burrs. There was the key. Thorne carried a great ring of them and used them all freely, in front of anyone, clattering, the cellars, the plate room, the muniment room where the family papers slept. All but one. There was one key, single, on a plain iron loop that he kept apart from the ring, in his waistcoat, and she had seen him touch it without thinking, the way a man touches a wound to be sure it still hurts. She had seen him do it twice, both times when he stood near the mouth of the sealed wing. She noticed. She filed it away. She did not yet know she was building a case. There was the tray. Eleanor rose early. A clergyman's daughter cannot sleep past the light, and one raw morning before the house was properly awake she passed the kitchen passage and saw the cook, old Bess, set out 2 breakfast trays. 2. One went up, plainly, to the family rooms. The other, plain crockery, a bowl of gruel, bread, a covered dish, Bess set on the end of the deal table and would not look at, and after a moment Thorne himself came and took it up and carried it away toward the back stairs. A steward carrying a tray. A steward who would not soil his cuffs on the accounts if he could help it, carrying a servant's breakfast up the back stairs with his own hands every morning. And that same tray, Eleanor would learn, came back down an hour later, not full, not untouched, but empty. Emptied, someone in this house was being fed in secret, and the man who fed her was the man who held the only key. She saw it. She did not yet understand it. That is the cruelty of a plot well built. All the pieces lie in plain sight, and it is only afterward, only when the picture completes itself, that you cry out at how long you looked at the truth and called it nothing. And there was Martha. Martha was the still-room maid, a woman of 50 with red hands and a closed face, who had been at Ravensmere longer than anyone save Thorne himself. Eleanor liked her. Eleanor made a point, as her mother had taught her, of learning the servants' names and their troubles, of asking after Martha's rheumatism and remembering the answer. And Martha, slowly, over those first days, had begun to thaw the smallest degree, a real good morning, a look that reached as high as Eleanor's chin. One evening Eleanor came upon her alone, changing the candles in the small parlour, and asked her, lightly, about the first Duchess. What had she been like? Was she kind? It was an idle question, the kind you ask to fill a companionable silence. Martha's hand stopped. The maid stood very still with a fresh candle in her fist, and something moved across her closed face, grief or fear, or the war between them. Her mouth opened. She drew a breath, as a person does at the very edge of speech, at the lip of some long-held thing about to fall. Her grace was, the parlour door opened. Thorne, Martha, the blue room want seeing to. That was all. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. But Martha shut like a book, and bobbed, and went, and did not once look back. And Thorne stood a moment in the doorway smiling his smooth smile at Eleanor, and said what a treasure old Martha was, so loyal, so discreet, and that some of the older servants dwelt too much on sad old days, and it did the house no good. Then he too was gone. Eleanor sat alone with the fresh candle burning and thought, she was going to tell me something. And then she thought, because she was still, God help her, a woman who assumed the best. She was going to tell me something sad, and he was sparing us both. She was wrong. But that is what she thought, and she let it be, and the not asking cost more than she could then have dreamed. Then came the dinner, and the machinery of the house closed its hand around her in front of witnesses. Edmund had asked her, one of his few requests, to receive some county company. Neighbours, chiefly a retired colonel and his wife, the rector and his sister. Sir Aldous Merrick, the county magistrate, a square grey man with square grey manners, who ate little and watched much. It was to be Eleanor's first turn as hostess of Ravensmere, and she had prepared for it with a clergyman's daughter's care, learned the menus, learned the names, chosen the flowers herself from the one cold glasshouse Thorne let her have. She wanted to do it well. She wanted, more than anything, to feel for one evening that this was truly her house. The great hall was lit that night as it was meant to be lit, every sconce burning, the long table a river of silver and candlelight, the dark old paintings pulled up out of their shadows into gold. It was beautiful. For one moment, coming down the stair in her good grey silk, Eleanor thought, perhaps I was foolish. Perhaps it is only an old sad house, and I have been frightening myself. Then she began to give her instructions to the footman, as a mistress does, and Thorne began, gently, to unmake her. It was so smoothly done that half the room never saw it. She would say a thing, the wines to be brought, the second course to be held a quarter hour, and Thorne, standing at the sideboard where a steward stands, would murmur a small correction to the footman, just after, just under, so that the man's eyes went to him and not to her, and the thing was done Thorne's way, and Eleanor's word simply, dissolved, twice, 3 times. Each time with a little deferential smile toward her, as if he were rescuing her from an error, as if she were a child permitted to play at the head of the table. The colonel's wife noticed. Eleanor saw her notice, saw the flick of the older woman's eyes between the young Duchess and the steward, saw the small tightening of a mouth that understood exactly what it was watching, and pitied her for it. That was the worst of it. Not the correction. The pity. And then Eleanor, quietly, meaning to reclaim one small thing that was hers, said to the footman that the north corridor windows might be opened a little, for the hall had grown close with all the candles and the company. Thorne set down what he held. He came forward, not fast, never fast, into the light, and he addressed her before the whole table, in a voice pitched for the whole table, warm and sorrowful, and absolutely without mercy. Your Grace is new to how things are done here, and we love her the better for her spirit. A soft laugh moved around the guests. He had told them how to hear it. But that corridor we keep shut, and shut it must stay. I'll not have it opened. Not tonight. Not for air, nor anything else. It runs past the poor late Duchess's rooms, and there are draughts there, and damps, and things a young bride of gentle nerves is far better never troubled with. I lock it for her Grace's own sake, for her nerves. He bowed to her, deep that taking bow. You'll thank me for it, in time. For her nerves. He hung the words in the candlelight of her own hall, and let them settle over her in front of the magistrate and the colonel and the rector and the pitying wife, the young Duchess, high-strung, fanciful, not to be trusted with so much as a window, managed for her own good by the good grey man who ran the house. And behind him, up on the wall where the candlelight reached, hung the long gallery, and the one portrait turned to face the plaster, its blank, back a small square of nothing among all that gilded staring. Eleanor stood very small at the head of her own table. She could have wept. Everything in her, young and hurt and humiliated, rose toward weeping. And here is the thing you must hold about Eleanor of Ravensmere, the thing that is the whole seed of all that comes after. She did not weep. Not there. Not in front of them. She lifted her chin the exact degree her mother had taught her, and she said, in a voice that did not shake, of course, Mr. Thorne, we wouldn't want our guests in a draught. And she smiled, and she turned the talk to the colonel's horses, and she carried that dinner through to its end on a straight back and a steady hand, and not one soul at that table knew what it cost her. Only Sir Aldous Merrick, the magistrate, square and grey and quiet, looked at her once across the silver, a long, level, measuring look, and looked then at Thorne, and said nothing at all, and filed it away behind his square grey face, the way a magistrate files a thing that may one day be wanted. Remember him. He watched that night. He was the kind of man who watches. When the guests were gone and the candles guttering, Eleanor went up to her cold room and sat on the edge of the bed and let herself, for exactly as long as it took the last carriage wheels to fade down the avenue, be the humiliated girl she had not permitted them to see. Then she stopped. She wiped her face. And something in her, something new, went very still and very clear. For her nerves, he had locked a corridor against her before witnesses and called it kindness. A man does not build a wall that high around nothing. You do not spend that much care, that much cream and sorrow and public shame to keep a young woman out of an empty passage full of damp. You spend it to keep her from something. And in the deep of that same night, as if the house had only been waiting for her to be ready to hear it, the sound came again through the stone. The weeping first, low, exhausted, the weeping of someone who has wept for years and no longer expects to be heard. And then, beneath it, the other thing. The voice. Clear, level, sane. Not the raving of a madwoman. Eleanor had grown up in a parish. She had sat with the truly afflicted. She knew the sound of a mind come loose, and this was not that. This was a woman speaking low to herself in the dark to keep herself company, saying, over and over, gently, like a prayer, like an anchor thrown to the bottom of a black sea, "My name is Clarissa. I am not mad. My name is Clarissa. I am not mad." Eleanor rose from her bed in her nightgown, with her heart going like a drum, and she went out into the cold corridor with a single candle, and she walked the length of the dark gallery under the staring portraits, past the one that would not stare, to the black oak door at the end. She put her ear to it, she put her hand flat against the cold wood, and on the other side of 2 inches of oak, so close now she could hear the breath catch between the words. The voice said her own name into the dark one more time, "My name is Clarissa," and then, sharp, hearing something, the voice stopped, and a whisper came through the crack at the base of the door. Frightened, barely a thread of sound. "Is someone there? Please, please, is someone there?" Eleanor did not answer. She could not. Every rule of that house, every soft warning, every "for her own sake and you'll thank me in time" pressed down on her at once and sealed her throat. If she answered, if she spoke one word, she made it real, and there would be no unmaking it. She stood shaking in the dark with her hand on the wood and a living woman breathing on the other side, and she understood, all at once and to the roots of her, what the tray meant, and what the single key meant, and what the turned portrait meant, and what "settled by me," God rest her, meant. She understood that the first Duchess of Ravensmere was not in the ground, she was in the wall, and she had been there, alive, calling her own name to keep from losing it, for a very long time. Eleanor took her hand from the door. She stepped back into the dark, and she went, silent, to find the one thing that stood between that woman and the daylight, the single iron key that never left the steward's waistcoat, day or night, the key he touched like a wound. She could not take it. She knew that. Thorne slept, they said, like an old dog, one eye open, and a man who guards a secret 4 years does not leave his key on a hook. But a clergyman's daughter who has watched a locksmith mend the church chest knows a thing or two that fine ladies do not, and she had one chance, and she took it in the smallest, quietest, least strategic way, the only kind of action Eleanor of Ravensmere ever knew how to take. The next evening, when Thorne came as he always came to make his report to her before supper, she had ready on the little table a dish of soft candle wax, cooling, set behind the ledger where he laid his keys down to turn the pages. He always laid the ring down to turn the pages. He was proud of his figures. He liked both hands free to show them off. He laid the great ring down, and beside it, careless for once, warm from the accounts, and full of his own cleverness, the single iron key. Eleanor asked him a long, dull question about the price of coal. Thorne loved to answer a long, dull question. He turned to the window, warming to it, hands moving, and while his back was to the table and his voice filled the room with shillings, she pressed the cold iron key once, hard, deep, into the waiting wax, the whole shape of it, ward and bit and bow, and lifted it out clean and had it back on the table beside the ring before he turned around. Her heart was a hammer. Her face, when he faced her again, was the mild, pleasant face of a young wife grateful to be instructed. She thanked him for explaining the coal. She had never in her life been so frightened or so sure. That night she gave the wax to the one man in the county she believed she could trust to keep his mouth shut, not a servant of the house, never that. She sent, quietly, on a pretext of a lost trinket needing a new clasp, to the locksmith in the market town, an honest old craftsman who had no love for Ravensmere and asked no questions of a Duchess's coin. And in 3 days a plain iron key came back to her, wrapped in a scrap of leather, cold and heavy in her palm, the twin of the one that lived against the steward's heart. She waited for a night when the house was fully down. She chose the dark of the moon. She let the last footstep die, the last door close, let the great house settle into its ticking silence, and then she lay listening a full hour more until she was certain of Thorne's snore 2 floors below, certain of the sleeping dark. Then she rose. She did not light a candle in her room. She carried it unlit until she was well down the corridor, and lit it there from the coals of the last dying sconce, one small flame in all that blackness. She wore her plainest wrap. Her feet were bare against the cold boards, so they would make no sound. In her right hand, warm now from her grip, she carried the key the locksmith had cut. The gallery was longer in the dark than it had ever been by day. The portraits watched her pass. 40 years of Ravensmere dead, gilt-framed, their painted eyes catching her one candle and throwing it back, so that as she moved 100 small lights seemed to open and follow her down the length of the hall. Her own breath was loud. The wax of the candle ran hot over her knuckles, and she did not feel it. At the end of the gallery the turned portrait hung, its blank canvas back a square of deeper dark, and she thought, "I know who you are now. I know your face is not gone. It is only turned away. Like you, and I am going to turn you back." She reached the black oak door. Behind it, silence. Whoever breathed on the other side was sleeping, or had stopped breathing to listen. She could not tell which. Eleanor set her candle in a niche in the stone, where its light would fall on the lock and not on her shaking hands. She looked back once, the whole length of the watching gallery, to be sure she was alone. Nothing moved. No draught, no Thorne, no cream-smooth voice out of the dark. Only the sleeping house, and the staring dead, and the one door that a man had built a whole fortress of kindness and lies to keep her from. She raised the key. Her hand was trembling so badly she had to steady her right wrist with her left. She thought, absurdly, of her father's church, of the heavy iron key to the vestry, of how he had let her turn it as a child, and how it had always seemed to her the most solemn sound in the world, that deep old click of a lock giving way. She thought of the voice saying, "My name is Clarissa, I am not mad," into 4 years of dark. She thought, if this key does not fit, if the locksmith failed, if I am wrong, and then she thought nothing at all, because there was nothing left to think, only to do. She fitted the cold iron into the lock. It went in all the way, smooth, to the very shoulder, the way a key goes home when it is truly cut for a lock, and Eleanor's breath stopped in her throat. On the other side of 2 inches of oak she heard, suddenly, a small, sharp intake of air. The sleeper waking. The breath of someone who has heard, after 4 years of no one, a key touch her door in the dead of night, and does not yet know whether it means her freedom or her end. The voice came then thin and terrified and utterly, unbearably clear, one whispered word pressed against the wood from the far side, so close it was almost inside Eleanor's own ear. "Silas?" Eleanor set her teeth. She closed her cold fingers around the key, and in the black gallery under 100 watching eyes, with the whole sleeping house of Ravensmere unaware above her and below her, the new Duchess began, slowly, so that the old lock would not cry out and wake the man who held its twin, to turn it. The lock did not cry out. It gave way the way old iron gives way when it is asked kindly, tooth by tooth, a long soft grinding that Eleanor felt more in her wrist than heard in her ear. And then the bolt slid, and the black oak door swung inward on hinges someone had kept oiled, and she understood in one cold breath what that meant. A man does not oil the hinges of a door he tells the world hides only the dead. She stepped through. The dark inside was not the dark of the gallery. It smelled of tallow and old linen, and something underneath that, faint and human. The smell of a person who has lived a long time in one small room. A candle stood guttering on a low table, and behind the table, pressed back against the far wall, stood a woman. She was thin. That was the first thing, and the worst. Thin the way a branch is thin in winter, all the softness stripped out of her, the bones of her wrists standing up under skin gone the colour of paper. Her hair was long and dark and streaked now with early grey, and she had gathered it back with her own 2 hands the moment the door moved, as if even here, even now, she meant to meet whatever came with her hair in order. Her eyes were enormous. They fixed on Eleanor and did not blink. "You are not Silas," the woman said. "No," said Eleanor. Her voice would barely come. "No, I am not." For a long moment neither of them moved. The candle threw their 2 shadows huge against the walls, and Eleanor saw that the walls were covered, every inch of plaster within a reaching arm's height, in faint scratched marks. Days, the woman had been counting the days with a nail, or a pin, or the edge of a spoon, and she had run out of clean wall a long time ago, and begun again over the top of the old marks, so that the count was lost, so that it was only motion now, the human hand refusing to stop marking that time was passing, and that a person was here to feel it pass. "Who are you?" the woman whispered. "My name is Eleanor." She found she had to hold to the doorframe. The house believes I am the Duchess of Ravensmere." Something crossed the thin face then. Not anger. Something worse than anger, a kind of terrible gentle understanding, as though she had been handed the last piece of a puzzle she had assembled alone in the dark over 4 years, and had prayed, right to the end, that she was wrong about. "Then he has married again," she said softly. "Edmund has married again." Her hand rose to her mouth. Oh, you poor child. Do you know what he means to do with you?" Eleanor could not answer that. She did not yet understand it. She crossed the small room instead, and she did the only thing her father's daughter knew how to do in the face of suffering she could not measure. She took the woman's cold, thin hands in both of hers, and she held them. "I don't know who you are," Eleanor said, "but you are not mad, and you are not going to spend another night behind that wall. Tell me your name." And the woman looked at her and drew a breath that shook the whole thin length of her, and said the name Eleanor had heard, whispered twice through 2 inches of oak, the name a woman had spoken aloud to herself in the dark so she would not forget it. "Clarissa," she said. "My name is Clarissa. I was the first Duchess of Ravensmere, and they told the world I died mad 4 years ago, and I have been alive in this room ever since." Eleanor had known it. She had assembled it, fact by fact, over 11 days, the tray, the key, the portrait turned to the wall. She had known it the way you know a thing in your head, but knowing it in your head and holding the living proof of it by 2 cold hands are not the same, and something in Eleanor's chest broke open and would not close again. How? She managed. How is it possible? There was a funeral. There is a stone in the chapel with your name on it. Clarissa's mouth moved in something that was almost, God help her, a smile. Is there? She said. Then, you had better ask Silas Thorne what he buried. They did not sleep that night, either of them. Eleanor did not dare take her from the room, not yet, not with Thorne's own quarters 2 staircases away, and the man himself carrying a tray to this very door at first light. To have Clarissa found gone would be to lose everything in a single morning. So instead, Eleanor sat with her on the narrow bed in that terrible little room, and by the light of the failing candle, in a whisper that never rose above the sound of the wind at the high window, Clarissa told her what had been done. It had begun, she said, so slowly she had not seen it. She had come to Ravensmere at 19, a bride as Eleanor was now, and Thorne had already been steward 11 years, and ran the estate as though it grew out of his own body. Edmund loved her. She was sure of that even now, even here. But Edmund was a man who wanted the world managed for him, and Thorne managed it, and the managing crept year by year into every corner of their lives, until there was no shilling spent, no letter sent, no visitor admitted, that did not pass through Silas Thorne's hands. I began to ask questions, Clarissa said. That was my whole crime. I asked to see the accounts. I asked why the tenants' rents came in but the roofs were never mended. I asked, once, in front of a dinner guest, why the steward drew a gentleman's salary and kept a gentleman's horse and dressed his sister in silk in the town. Her thin fingers tightened on Eleanor's. You must understand. A wife who asks is an inconvenience. But a wife who asks in front of witnesses is a danger, and a danger, to a clever man, need not be killed. It need only be, explained, he had begun with small things, she said. A word to Edmund that the Duchess seemed tired, seemed low. A remark to the housekeeper that her Grace had wept for no reason. A physician, a Dr. Croft, brought quietly up from the county town, a soft frightened man in debt to the estate, who examined her and frowned and murmured of nerves, of hysteria, of the delicacy of the female constitution. And every true thing she said after that, every accurate, sane, provable thing about the money and the roofs and the rents, became, in the mouth of Silas Thorne, another symptom. That is the trap, Clarissa whispered. Do you see it? Once they have said you are mad, your sanity is the proof of your madness. Rage is madness. Weeping is madness. Calm is the cunning of the madwoman. There is no thing you can do inside that word that does not feed it. I learned to say nothing at all. And do you know what he told Edmund then? That I had fallen silent, that the disease had entered its final stage. Eleanor sat very still in the dark. The death, she said. You said to ask what he buried. Croft signed a certificate, said Clarissa. Consumption of the brain, he called it. A fine phrase. Meaning nothing, meaning whatever a paid man needs it to mean. There was a closed coffin. Thorne insisted on the closed coffin himself. The Duchess was so wasted, he said, so terrible to look on, that he could not permit her husband's last memory to be so cruel a one. He spared Edmund the sight of the body. She laughed, once a dry, awful sound. There was no body. There was sand and stones and an old bolster, for all I know. I was already up here. He carried me up the back stairs the night before, drugged, in my own funeral week, and I woke in this room to the sound of them singing my burial hymn in the chapel below. I could hear it through the floor. I heard them bury me, Eleanor. I heard my own funeral. The candle went out then, of its own accord, drowned in its own wax, and for a moment they sat in a blackness so total that Eleanor could not tell where her own hands ended. And out of that blackness Clarissa's voice came, steadier now, as though the dark were where she was strongest, having lived in it so long. But why keep me, she said, before Eleanor could ask it? You are wondering why he did not truly kill me. A body in the ground can be dug up. A wife in a locked room he can produce, if he ever needs to. But that is not the whole of it. He kept me because of the money, because a dead Duchess and a living one are worth different things under the law. And there is a paper, Eleanor, there is a paper you must find. The paper, she said, was a codicil, a late addition to the old Duke's settlement, Edmund's father's settlement, that governed the great consolidated fund of the estate. £62,000, drawn together over 3 generations, held in trust for the line of Ravensmere. And the codicil, as Thorne had written it, because Thorne had written it, in a clerk's fair hand, and got it witnessed by 2 men in his pocket, and slipped it among the true papers in the muniment room, the codicil said that if the direct line should fail, if there should be no Duchess and no heir at the coming of Lady Day in a given year, the whole management of that fund and the use of its income for his natural life should pass to the faithful steward who had served the family so long. "Do you hear it?" Clarissa breathed. "If the line fails, he needs the line to fail. He needed me gone with no child, and I gave him no child, I could not. That was my other crime, and he needs Edmund to have no heir. And now Edmund has married you." Her hand found Eleanor's face in the dark, thin fingers cool against her cheek. "Oh, my dear, do you understand now why I said you poor child? He is not going to let you give Edmund a son. You are the second wife. You are meant to fail exactly as I failed. He has done it once. He knows every step of the road. And this year, this Lady Day, the paper comes due." Eleanor sat in the dark of the sealed room and felt the whole shape of it close over her like water. The dark rooms, the silent servants, the steward who managed her every shilling and admitted her every visitor and had already, 11 days in, begun to speak to the household of her Grace being new, being nervous, being unused to how things were done. She had thought it arrogance. It was groundwork. He was laying, around her, the same slow, patient trap he had laid around the woman whose hands she held. And she had walked into the house and helped him by trusting the machinery, by trusting him, because he ran everything and everything ran smoothly, and she had been a clergyman's daughter, grateful to be managed. "He means to make me mad," she said. It was not a question. "He means to make the world call you mad," said Clarissa. "It is the same thing to a court. It is the same thing to a husband who wants to be spared." Eleanor stood up in the darkness. She did not weep. She had not wept in front of Thorne when he belittled her before the dinner guests, and she would not weep now, when there was work to do. "Then we will not fight him with your word or mine," she said. "A freed madwoman's word is nothing. A frightened new wife's word is nothing. He has built it so. We will fight him with paper. His paper. If there is a false codicil, then somewhere there is a true will it lies against. And a physician who signed a false certificate is a man who can unsign it, if the right person asks him in the right way. You have given me the whole map, Clarissa. Now I have to walk it before Lady Day, and I have to do it while that man carries you a breakfast tray every morning and never dreams the door has been opened." She could just see, by the grey of the high window beginning at last to pale toward dawn, the thin face turn up to her. "You would do that," Clarissa said. "You could walk out of this room and lock it behind you and be safe. He would never know you had been here. You could simply leave, go to your father, be free of the whole house, and leave you here." "Yes." "No," said Eleanor, and that was all. She bent and kissed the older woman's forehead as she might have kissed a sister, and she promised her daylight, and she went out, and, because it was the hardest thing she had yet done, and therefore the most necessary, she drew the black oak door shut behind her and turned the key and left Clarissa in the dark one morning more, so that Silas Thorne would find everything exactly as he had left it, and suspect nothing. She was in her own bed, in her nightgown, her hair down, when she heard on the far stair the tread she now knew for what it was, the steward at first light, carrying up a tray from a kitchen where old Bess set out 2 each morning and had long ago stopped asking why. The days that followed were the strangest of Eleanor's life, and the finest and the most frightening, because she lived every hour of them in 2 houses at once. In one house she was the new Duchess, soft and grateful and slightly overwhelmed, deferring to Mr. Thorne's judgment, thanking him for his patience, asking his advice on the smallest things and letting him give it. She played that Eleanor to the hilt. She let him believe the trap was closing on a woman who did not feel it. And in the other house, the secret one, she was something her father would not have recognized. A woman gathering evidence against a murderer who was not quite a murderer, quiet and patient and very much afraid. She began with the muniment room. It was Thorne's own ground, the little stone-floored chamber off the old wing where 3 generations of the estate's papers lay in their boxes and presses, and he kept it locked. But a duchess may ask for the household accounts, and no steward may refuse her without a reason he does not want to give. So she asked. And she sat in that cold room by lamplight with the ledgers open before her, as though she were only a diligent young wife learning her husband's business, and while a footman dozed in the passage, she went through the deed boxes with hands that shook. She found the codicil on the 3rd afternoon. She knew it the moment she saw it, because it was too clean. Every other paper in that press was foxed and soft with age, the ink gone brown, the folds worn nearly through. The codicil was crisp. The ink was black. The hand was a beautiful clerk's copperplate, and the 2 witnessing signatures beneath it were names she did not know, and the wax of its seal had none of the dust of 40 years in it. It sat among the old papers like a cuckoo's egg in a wren's nest, and it said, in its lovely lying hand, everything Clarissa had told her it would say, if the line should fail. On Lady Day, to the faithful steward for the term of his natural life. She did not take it. She was not such a fool as that. A paper gone would tell him everything. She copied it, word for word, in her own hand, folded the copy small, and hid it in the bodice of her gown, and put the true false thing back exactly where it had lain. It was as she was closing the press that she heard, in the passage, that the footman had woken and was speaking to someone, and the someone answered in a voice like cream over stone, and Eleanor's blood went to water. Thorne, Thorne, come to the muniment room, and the lamp on the table warm, and the deed box open, and the Duchess standing over 3 generations of the family's secrets, with her heart slamming in her throat. She had one moment. She used it. When the door opened, and Silas Thorne stood in it, tall and unhurried, his eyes going at once to the lamp, and the open box, and her face, Eleanor was already turning toward him with an expression of pure vexed domestic irritation, a length of household linen inventory in her hand. "Mr. Thorne, thank heaven, perhaps you can make sense of it. Bess swears we are 3 dozen pillow slips short from the spring wash, and I cannot find where they are entered, and I have been an hour over these wretched books, and I am no nearer." She let a little laugh break, rueful, tired, the laugh of a young mistress out of her depth. "I begin to see why my husband leaves all of this to you. It is a labyrinth." For a long, long moment Silas Thorne looked at her. His eyes were pale and very steady, and they moved once, deliberately, from her face to the open deed box and back, and Eleanor understood that he was deciding something, and that her whole life stood on the decision. Then something in his face eased, not warmed, eased, the way a man eases when a suspicion he had half formed is answered by a thing more likely. A silly young wife hunting pillow slips in the wrong box. Of course. What else would she be? "Your Grace should not trouble herself with the muniment room," he said, and crossed and shut the deed box with his own hand gently, and took up the lamp. "The linen accounts are kept in the still room press, not here. An easy mistake. Allow me," and he held the door for her, and saw her out, courteous as ever, and Eleanor walked past him close enough to smell the pomade in his hair, and did not run, and did not falter, and got herself around the first corner of the passage before she had to put her hand against the cold stone wall and stand a moment with her eyes shut. That was the nearest she came to being caught. It was near enough. The physician was easier and harder both. Dr. Croft lived 9 miles off in the county town, and Eleanor reached him under the cover of a charitable errand, a new Duchess visiting the town's poor. What could be more natural? And she came to his door alone in the failing light and asked to see him on a private matter. He was a soft man gone to fat and fear, exactly as Clarissa had drawn him, and when Eleanor said, quietly, in his own consulting room, "I have come to speak with you about the death of the first Duchess of Ravensmere," she watched the colour go out of his face like wine out of a tipped glass. She did not threaten him. That was not her way, and it was not, she judged, the way that would work. She told him instead, very simply, that she knew, that the Duchess was alive, that she had held her hands and heard her speak, and that the woman was as sane as either of them in that room. And she watched 4 years of a bad man's fear war in Croft's face, with 4 years of a weak man's conscience, and she saw the conscience begin, slowly, to win. Because it is a terrible thing to be reminded that the sin you have half persuaded yourself was only a paper, only a signature. Only a phrase in Latin is in fact a living woman scratching the days on a wall. He said it would harm no one, Croft whispered. He had his face in his hands. He said she was, that keeping her quiet was a kindness, that it spared the Duke, that no one need ever, God forgive me. God forgive me. There is a certificate in my own hand that says that woman is dead. Then write another in your own hand, said Eleanor, that says how she is not. He did. That night, at his own desk, weeping, he wrote it all, the false certificate, the closed coffin he had counselled, the fee that had cleared his debt to the estate, the whole architecture of the lie, and he signed it, and Eleanor carried it out of the county town, folded against her heart beside the copied codicil, and she thought, 2 papers now, his paper and the doctor's, and 1 true will somewhere against the false one, and then he is undone. The true will she got from the last quarter she looked, from Mr. Peverell, the family's own solicitor, a dry old man in the county town who had drawn the settlement for Edmund's father and had wondered, quietly, for 4 years, why the estate's great fund was being administered under a codicil he had never seen and did not remember engrossing. He had said nothing, because a solicitor says nothing, because the steward paid the estate's fees, and the steward was the estate. But when the new young Duchess sat across his desk and laid before him a copy of that codicil, and asked him, plainly, whether he had drawn it, the old man read it twice, and set it down and said, "No, madam, I did not draw this, and I can tell you the 2 men who witnessed it, for I know every clerk in this county, and neither of those 2 has been alive these 6 years. He looked at her over his spectacles. "You have brought me a forgery, your grace, a forgery upon the estate of Ravensmere. May I ask where you found it?" And Eleanor told him everything. She thought, afterward, that she had perhaps 3 days more in hand than she truly did. She was wrong. She had misjudged the one thing she could not see, that a man like Silas Thorne, who had run a great house 40 years by knowing everything before anyone told him, does not need to be caught to grow suspicious. A duchess who visits the town's poor twice in 1 week. A physician's boy who mentions her grace called on the doctor. A dry note from Peverell asking, out of nowhere, after certain deeds. Thorne did not know what she had, but he knew the shape of a woman moving against him, because he had seen it once before, and he had promised himself he would see it sooner the second time. He moved first. Eleanor came down one grey morning 3 days before Lady Day to find the household changed around her. Servants who would not meet her eye, a footman posted at the foot of her own stair, and Silas Thorne waiting for her in the small parlour with Edmund beside him. Poor Edmund, grey and stooped, and unable to look at his wife, and a letter open on the table that Eleanor knew at a glance for one of her own to Peverell, intercepted, unsealed, read, "Your Grace has not been well," said Thorne. His voice was gentle. It was the gentlest she had ever heard it, and it froze her to the marrow. "His Grace and I have been much concerned. This correspondence," he touched the letter. "These journeys, these fancies about the North Wing, I had hoped to spare you, as I could not spare another, but I fear her Grace's nerves have quite overmastered her. A physician has been sent for. You will keep to your rooms, madam, and rest, until he comes to say what is best to be done." And she saw it, whole, the trap sprung at last, the word already spoken, the household already prepared, the husband already half persuaded, the physician already summoned to sign the second wife into the dark, exactly as the first had been signed. He had begun to bury her, and he had done it in a morning, and by Lady Day the line would have failed, and £62,000 would come home to the faithful steward for the term of his natural life. But Silas Thorne had made, that morning, one error, and it was the same error he had made 40 years running, the error at the very root of him. He was certain no woman placed in that house would look past him. He was certain, even now, that the Duchess's journeys had been the flutterings of a frightened girl, and that whatever she had gathered was locked, like everything else, in his own house, under his own hand. He did not know she had already carried the papers out. He did not know they were 9 miles off, in the strong box of Mr. Peverell, who had that very morning laid the whole of it, the forged codicil, the doctor's confession, the true settlement, before Sir Aldous Merrick, the county magistrate, who had sat silent at Eleanor's own dinner-table not 2 weeks past, and watched a steward correct a duchess before her guests, and had said nothing, and had wondered ever since at what he saw. He was wondering no longer. They came the next afternoon. Eleanor, locked in her rooms, heard the horses on the gravel first, more than one, many, and then the great door below, and then voices in the hall, and she was let out by a shaking footman who no longer knew whom in that house it was safe to obey, and she came down the great staircase into the candlelit hall to find it filled exactly, as it had been filled on the night of the dinner when Thorne had made her small before them all. The same high, dark hall, the same guests, some of them, and the same servants ranged along the walls, and behind them the 40 years of family portraits, and among the guests now Sir Aldous Merrick with 3 of his men, and old Peverell with his strong-box, and Dr. Croft Grey and trembling with his own confession in his hand, and Silas Thorne, tall and unhurried, in the middle of the floor, beginning, even now, even seeing them all, to explain. "Sir Aldous, you have been misled. Her Grace is not well. I have papers from a physician. You have a great many papers, Mr. Thorne," said the magistrate. "We are come about your papers." Open the north wing, and there it was. The whole hall heard it. The whole hall went still. Thorne did not move. The north wing has been sealed since the late Duchess died of her madness. "There is nothing there but open it," said Sir Aldous, "or my men will." They took the key from him. That was the moment Eleanor would remember all her life, not the shouting, for there was no shouting, but the small, quiet indignity of 2 of the magistrate's men taking from Silas Thorne's own waistcoat the single iron key on its plain iron loop, the key he had never in 40 years let out of his keeping, and the look on his face as it left his hand. It was not rage. Clarissa had been right about that too. It was calculation. It was the face of a man running the numbers of his own arithmetic, and arriving, for the first time in his life, at a sum that would not come out. They went up. The hall waited, and Eleanor, standing at the foot of the stair beside Edmund, who had begun, silently to shake, heard the far door open 2 floors above, the black oak door, the oiled hinges, and then, after a long, long pause, footsteps coming back down. Slow footsteps, 2 sets, and into the candlelight of the great hall of Ravensmere, on the arm of a magistrate's man, thin and blinking and upright, her long grey streaked hair gathered back with her own 2 hands, walked the woman the whole county had buried 4 years before. The servants along the walls made a sound Eleanor had never heard a group of people make, a low, broken, indrawn moan, the sound of 40 years of crossing themselves at a haunted door meeting, all at once, the plain fact that there had never been a ghost. There had been a woman. Old Martha, the still-room maid who had once begun to speak and stopped herself, put her apron over her face and wept aloud, and did not stop. And Edmund made no sound at all. He stood at the foot of his own staircase and looked at the wife he had mourned, the wife whose funeral hymn he had sung, the wife he had been so tenderly spared the sight of in her coffin, and his face was the face of a man watching a murder run backward, watching the dead climb up out of the ground, watching the single worst grief of his life reveal itself as the single worst lie. He tried to speak her name. He could not. He got one broken step toward her, and then his legs would not hold him, and he went down on his knees on the stone floor of his own hall with his hands over his face, and wept the way a man weeps who has just understood exactly what he trusted and exactly what it cost. Clarissa looked at him a long moment. Then she looked at Eleanor, and something passed between the 2 women that no one else in that hall could read, and she turned to the magistrate, and she spoke, her first full sentence spoken freely, in 4 years, to a room that could no longer disbelieve her. "My name is Clarissa, Duchess of Ravensmere," she said. Her voice was thin, and it did not shake. "I was not mad. I am not dead. And that man walled me alive behind 2 inches of oak for asking what he did with my husband's money. Everything else in this house he can explain. Ask him to explain me." He could not explain her. That was the whole of it, and it was beautiful in its plainness. Sir Aldous Merrick did not need the Duchess's word or Eleanor's word or any woman's word at all, because Silas Thorne had spent 40 years committing everything he did to paper in a fine clerk's hand, and now Mr. Peverell opened his strong-box on the long table in the candlelight and read it all back to him. He read the true settlement of the old Duke, that named no steward and never had. He read the forged codicil against it and named the 2 witnesses who had been 6 years dead when their names were set to it, and the hall heard the arithmetic of £62,000 and the coming Lady Day laid out cold. And then he read Dr. Croft's confession, the false certificate, the empty closed coffin, the fee that cleared a weak man's debt, and Croft himself stood against the wall and did not deny a word of it, only wept, which was confession enough. Each paper fell on Silas Thorne like a separate stone, and here was the justice of it, the true shape of it, the thing Eleanor understood as she watched. He was not undone by her cleverness, nor by Clarissa's suffering, nor by any scheme worked against him. He was undone by his own hand. Every arrangement he had made to seize the estate, the will he forged, the death he faked. The doctor he bought, the wife he buried alive to keep against a day of need, every single one of them, brought into the candlelight, became the evidence that convicted him. The secret he had built to make himself master of the house was the secret that broke him in front of it. He had been so certain of his own competence that he had written his crimes down in a fair hand and locked them where only he could reach, and where, therefore, they waited 40 years for the one person who would look past him to find them. They took him in the magistrate's own custody, there, before the guests and the servants and the ranked portraits, before the exact audience that had watched him rule that hall and belittle its new mistress a fortnight since. He did not struggle. He walked out between 2 men with his back straight, and he said only one thing, at the door, turning his pale, steady eyes once more on Eleanor. "I told him no woman placed in this house would look past me," he said. "You were right," said Eleanor, "for 40 years, and she said no more, and did not gloat, and let him go out into the dark with the truth walking behind him. She stepped back instead to stand beside Clarissa and took the older woman's thin hand in hers, and the two Duchesses of Ravensmere stood together in the candlelight and let the paper speak, because it had so much still to say and needed no help from them at all. The spring came late to Northumberland that year, as it always does, but it came, and on a morning in April, with the light coming long and gold across the moor, the windows of the north wing of Ravensmere stood open, all of them, thrown wide, the sealed glass unsealed, the air Clarissa had not breathed clean in 4 winters, moving at last through rooms that had been kept dark so long the very walls had forgotten the sun. She was in the garden. That was where Eleanor found her most mornings now, in the walled south garden Clarissa had planted as a bride of 19 and had not seen since, sitting on a stone bench with her face turned up to the light like a plant too long indoors, her grey streaked hair loose on her shoulders because she never bound it back in fear any longer. She was still thin. She would always, Eleanor thought, be a little thin. But there was colour coming back into her, slowly, the way colour comes back into the world in the north after a hard winter, and she laughed sometimes now, and that was worth more than any verdict. Silas Thorne was tried at the county assizes and transported for his life, and the fine clerk's hand that had run Ravensmere 40 years signed nothing after that but the register of the ship. The great consolidated fund, so long settled by his careful management, was found on Mr. Peveril's honest accounting to be a good deal less consolidated than the ledgers had claimed, and the unsettling of those settled affairs kept the solicitor busy the better part of a year. But it came home in the end to the family it had always belonged to, which was more than Thorne had ever meant it to do. Edmund never quite recovered, and perhaps did not deserve to, and knew it. He lived quietly now, at the far end of the house, an older man aged past his years, and if he had a peace at all it was that both his wives were alive under his roof, and that neither of them, in the end, had asked him for anything but the truth he had been too comfortable to want. Martha the maid served the 2 duchesses to the end of her days, and told the story to any who would hear it, and always ended it the same way, that she had always known there was a woman behind that door, and had been too afraid of Mr. Thorne to say the one word that might have freed her 4 years sooner. It was Martha who finally spoke. When it counted, it was Martha's word to the magistrate, when a kind mistress had earned it, that had turned suspicion into a warrant. Kindness, Eleanor came to understand, is not weakness. It is only patient. It waits in the silence until someone gives them leave to speak. There was one thing left to do, and the 2 women did it together, on that gold April morning, in the long gallery under the 40 years of watching portraits. For 4 years one of those portraits had hung with its face to the wall, a young dark-haired woman in the dress of a bride, turned round so that the house need not look at her and she need not look at the house. An erased thing, a shame, a ghost. Eleanor and Clarissa lifted it down between them, they turned it, and they hung it back on its old hook the right way round, so that the painted face of the first Duchess of Ravensmere, young and dark-haired and not yet betrayed, looked out once more down the length of the gallery into the long spring light falling through the opened windows. The 2 women stood back and looked at it a while, the living woman and her own young painted face, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. There are truths that men wall up behind 2 inches of oak, and seal, and teach a whole house to cross itself and look away from, and they will keep those truths in the dark for 4 years or 40. Patient as a woman scratching the days on a wall, but a wall is only a wall, and a key, even a stolen one, even a frightened one, cut in secret and carried in a trembling hand, will open what it was cut to open. The dark does not win because it is strong. It wins only for as long as no one is willing to walk down the gallery, past all the staring eyes, and try the door. Someone was willing. That is the whole of the story. Tell me, comment the town you're watching from. I would like to know how far a story like this one travels.